Welcome back to the Faith Forward podcast. John Ackerman, Brian Bales, and this is our last podcast before we all take a break for the summer. So happy summer vacation.
Whew.
It.
Yeah, it's summer technically, even on the calendar now.
Yeah,
so
it is.
Seems we should do some vacation. I actually spent on Monday of last week, new federal holiday. So it was awesome. Celebrate the freedom that we have here in the United States at a different level than maybe we've celebrated before.
Yeah.
And I celebrated that by going to the pool for a little bit with my son. And it was nice. It was nice. I figured I had to get burnt a little bit before I actually go on vacation to get burnt a lot.
Sure.
So that was the plan. That was the plan.
So summer is here. Lots of celebrations already happening. End of school, graduations, transitions to the next parts of life. And we're wrapping up this series on celebration. We've been in here about 3 weeks now. This is the last week. If you didn't catch the Sunday message, Pastor Lee Towns was actually talking very specifically about Sabbath and how that pertains to celebration. So you're going to catch people up a little bit on where we were for the last couple of weeks, right?
Yeah, because Sabbath is a call to rest, right? And he did a lot of things in that message that if you haven't listened to all of it, you need to go back because my recap is not going to give it justice, right? I love one of the specific things where we take Sabbath and we make it into very specific due to the word Sabbath, and even broke down what that word means. I'm not going to give it away. You got to watch. You haven't watched, right? And how we attach some things to it that aren't necessarily unhelpful, but they aren't necessarily accurate in some way. So, here's his 3 main points. That Sabbath actually is a gift, and it's a beautiful gift for those who actually work through that resistance we have in us and would be willing to actually receive it. It's not a call to be lazy. It's not a call to be unproductive. It's actually a gift from our Creator, the one who loves us, that sent his son to die for us, for our life. But also he went to this fact that Sabbath is actually, I believe, the most misused and abused and neglected commandment. I used that as an illustration a couple of weeks ago when it really just got my attention. When I can't even remember if I read it or I said in the sermon or I heard it from someone else, but it was just like, this hit me. Like, of course I wouldn't murder someone or steal or do these other stuff. I was totally okay saying, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. That doesn't apply to me. But I think what's really interesting is that when we think about Sabbath and the call to rest, it actually requires some work in order to be able to rest. But work isn't always bad. Right? We have this tendency to think about work as punishment, especially when we think about the garden, right? From the sweat of your brow. But they worked before we considered it as punishment. In fact, this actually, when we think about work, is all the good type of work we need to be doing. So Sabbath does require work, but for most of us, myself included for a very long time, it requires work not necessarily in the way that we think. So that's sort of the highlights of what Pastor Lee talked about. Definitely listen or go back and listen again. I don't know that it would hurt any of us to catch it twice.
Probably not.
Yeah.
So, again, as we're wrapping up this series, as we're wrapping up this season of the podcast, and as we're really trying to bring home this idea of how do we practically grow in our ability, in our capacity, in our willingness to engage in the gift of Sabbath, of celebration, as Pastor Lee said, receiving this gift that we're being given. And we struggle with receiving in many cases. We're so much more comfortable working. We've been talking about this for months now. We're honestly so much more comfortable with a transactional relationship because we feel like we better understand the parameters. I do something, God does something. God does something, I do something. There's reciprocity there, right? We keep the balances even. They're not even close to even. They'll never be close to even, but we feel like that transactional relationship makes sense. And so Sabbath is just yet another example of God tilting the scales radically in his favor of what he's giving versus what he's asking. And so how do we learn to do this well? Not out of a need to perform, but simply because one of the best things you can do as the recipient of a gift is receive it well and not just go, oh, thanks, and shove that aside.
Yeah, and here's the interesting thing. For some of you, like, well, I didn't receive the gift well because it wasn't a good gift. And I think we've all necessarily had those moments. I still remember, I love my grandma, God bless her soul. She used to always send me stuff, right, every year. And I still remember, I was probably 25, 26 years old. And she sent me, you'll love this, a cream sweater, John, that was long sleeve, crew neck right here. And on the front was a really big buck right on the front. And there's a lot of sweaters in this world that I may wear. That would not be the one of it. But I still remember, I knew she would ask. And so I wore it one time.
Yep.
Christmas Eve, she called, Brian, how do you like your sweater? I said, Grandma, I like it so much. I'm wearing it right now. I deceived her. So don't ever do that. I made her think of something it didn't. That was my Ananias moment. We'll talk about it some other time. But I do think that we have the tendency to think about Sabbath wrongly so that we could think maybe it's not a good gift, so we don't know how to receive it well. There was my connection. Eventually, I got to it. But every good and perfect gift comes from God. He does not give bad gifts. So if we're struggling with the gift, it's not because it's bad. It's because there's something about it that we need to understand better, or something within us that Jesus needs to transform it in us to receive it better.
Yeah. And this is part of the genius of God, that he recognizes that in giving us this gift, a gift of rest is actually going to require us to work in order to learn how to rest. So he's always after our transformation. He's always inviting us closer, deeper into relationship with him. And so even in this phenomenal gift of rest and recovery every 7 days, not only from physical labor, but emotional, spiritual, like the whole shebang, there's a day where you're supposed to stop performing, stop earning, but he creates it in such a way that it's disruptive enough, uncomfortable enough, that it either draws us closer to him or it almost drives us away from him, right? I don't know how to Sabbath. I don't even know how to engage with God on Sabbath, so I'm just not going to, right? I'm just going to answer more emails, right? But his invitation is always to come closer. And so this is actually where the work comes, that Sabbath requires work on our part, but it's not the work that we think.
John and I, we say this oftentimes in the podcast. Sometimes when we're talking, things pop to our head. And so you were just talking, and I think one of the things that as you were talking, God was just telling me, here's an example of way I Sabbath poorly. I will Sabbath on this particular day, but in order to feel more justified, I will make that next day a 12-hour day.
Sure.
Right? I will make that next day, and I'm thinking right now I'm sort of on the edge of leaving and going out of town for some vacation. And I realize, how what I do is to try to justify those other Sabbath moments is I just instead try to then jam X amount of work or X amount of time in a smaller amount of days in the calendar. And that, again, isn't really trusting God. That's just saying, all right, I'm just going to kick the work to another time. I'm going to do those sort of things. And it just kind of struck me that I do that a lot naturally and don't even necessarily think about it, because I think about it sometimes as, well, I got to get it done. So I'm just going to take this day off. And this day I'm going to get a whole bunch more done. And it's still missing the point of allowing God to do for us in 6 days what the world needs 7 to do. And that's just one of the things where for me, that's some work I got to do. So a little moment for me. Thank you for listening.
So some of the things that we want to get practical with from Lee's message today. This is going to definitely be, the last time we talked about Sabbath, so 2 weeks ago, we paused in the middle of this series for Father's Day and that sort of spiritual checkup. 2 weeks ago, 2 episodes back, we started talking about celebration and Sabbath, and a lot of it was an invitation to consider the external, right? How do we go and do Sabbath? What sorts of activities feel Sabbathy, if I can say it that way, right? What kinds of things would help us to rest and recover and engage and connect with God? And with Lee's message this week, the invitation is going to be to go internal, to take a look at a heart level of what does make you uncomfortable with the idea of Sabbath. What makes you uncomfortable either with the idea of rest or with the idea of slowing down or with the idea of truly putting the kibosh on this transactional interchange with God. And so one of the places that we're going to start, and one of the places that Lee brought up in his message, is that we struggle to engage with Sabbath. We struggle to observe the Sabbath because, frankly, we're just comfortable hiding in our busyness. That we're far more comfortable in that space of let me just do more. In some cases, do good things. In some cases, even do good things in the name of God, because we don't really know how to stop and just be with God. And rather than go through the discomfort of learning how to do that, I'll just go do another thing for God. So one of the things that we wanted to talk about here is just, again, all of these are really good, helpful things to do between you and God in conversation, in periods of quiet and reflection. What's the mentality that you have towards busyness and Sabbath? We talked a couple weeks ago about one of the stories that Jesus tells. He tells the story of a lost coin, of a lost sheep, and then he tells the story of a father with 2 sons. and one of those sons runs off and wastes all of his resources in prodigal living. But the other son self-professes that he's been slaving for his father, trying to do all the right things at all the right times. And the father gets to have these beautiful exchanges with both, where the fact that they're both off in their thinking, both about what they should be doing, but also about who their father is. And you hear people talk about these different mentalities in different ways. And so for the sake of condensing this down into just one word each, if we look at that other older brother, again, he calls it himself, I have a slave mentality. I'm slaving for you. I'm trying to earn things that have actually already been given to me. And the younger son, the younger brother, let's call it an orphan mentality, right? Because he tells his father, give me all my inheritance, which means I basically wish you were dead, which means I basically have no father. I'm on my own, and I'm going to go make it in the world without you. And so an orphan mentality, it's all up to me. I'm all alone, and it's all up to me. And a slave mentality, I have to earn it, or God won't bless me, love me, provide for me. Both of those get in the way of us resting, because neither one would actually allow it.
No, I think the question that you're calling us to ask is, in the stillness, in the pause, and again, it's possible to have both at the same time, right? I know that I bounce back and forth depending upon certain things in my life. But did one of those resonate with you, right? And if one of them did, it's an insight to how we view our relationship with the God of the universe. And we often, well-intentionally, view the God of the universe through wrong lenses. We're not trying to. I mean, there's a whole lot of my life, John, where I did not realize that I was viewing God almost exclusively through this sort of orphan lens. I related to God much more like an orphan would to a foster parent instead of a son to a father. And so that meant it was up to me. It meant that I had to do it. If I didn't do it, it wouldn't happen. And so the very idea of taking Sabbath would imply, if I take Sabbath, again, then I'm going to have to do 14 or 16 hours worth of work. See, I'm still working on it on the next day. Or it meant that it wouldn't get done. Right? And I know that I had this thought for a long time, and we've talked about this offline before, that I used to have this very revealing sort of orphan thought about God. Like, I could view myself holding on to maybe the steering wheel of life, or maybe if you like a ship analogy, you're holding on to the big wheel there. And the way that I thought about life was that I wish I could take my hand off the steering wheel. I wish I could take my hand off, this wheel that's going about the ship of my life. But whenever I took my hand off, the end result was everything went wrong. It was more punishment trying to clean up the things that went wrong than it was never being able to enjoy life by always driving. So I felt like either I had to always drive and not enjoy Sabbath, or that I had to pay a penalty for taking a moment of rest. And I think a lot of us may know what that feels like, because that could have been the reality of what your earthly relationship has been like with someone. But that's not how the God of the universe works. And one of the great tricks of the enemy is to begin to allow us or tempt us to look at God through the lens of our earthly relationships. And even if you had a phenomenally great earthly relationship with everyone that you know, pick everyone you ever know, it would still fall short. Right? It's not perfect. And so for me, I think there was a lot of that orphan mentality. And so I couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. And for me, again, it wasn't about I had to earn it all the time, even though there was some, I was like, I just didn't want the punishment of it going bad. Because then I had to clean it up. I had to clean up my own party. Right? And should that be the rules? Like, that should be the rules. Like, if you have a party, right, you should not have to clean up your own party. But that's how a lot of us feel.
So if you're hearing, as you're processing that, I think these are the really helpful things that will help us to figure out the way that we see ourselves, the way that we see God, and the way that we see this gift of Sabbath, right? So, if you don't already feel like you have an association to either that orphan mentality or that slave mentality, just ask yourself the question and see what comes up. What would happen if I stopped today and genuinely experienced Sabbath? What is that internal voice that's always present and not always the happy, healthy one, right? What's that first response that comes up when you contemplate the idea of, all right, so this Saturday, this Sunday, I'm really going to dive into Sabbath to the best of my ability. First thought that comes up, you're going to have to pay for it later, right? That's a really helpful indicator. Or, it's not going to work, right? That's a really, right? Those initial thoughts that come to mind. Or maybe it's what would other people say if you told them, hey, this Saturday, this Sunday, like I'm not really going to be available. I'm turning off my phone. I'm shutting down the laptop. You really won't be able to get a hold of me because I'm going to take this day and really dedicate it to connecting with God.
Yep.
Are you stupid? What's wrong with you? Like, how are you going to, right? What are those initial thoughts that are coming? And notice what they expose.
Well, it's interesting. You said stupid. For me, the natural one would be, are you lazy?
Yeah.
Right? It's really interesting how it could sneak into our lives that time spent cultivating your relationship with God, while we would say intellectually that it is more important than any other relationship we should cultivate. You look at our calendar, it doesn't look that way. In fact, almost like if we say it out loud, it feels like we're being lazy, or I always seem like that really hyper spiritual person that we don't want to seem like that, or whatever it might be. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with seeming hyper spiritual if we're trying to grow in a relationship with God.
Yep.
It's a problem if we're trying to be someone who's very legalistic or judgmental, but that's not what this is about, because as we spend more time with God, we become to know God better, and we begin to be transformed as we allow that. And so again, when you say that, like, are you crazy? This is all going to go bad. Are you lazy? Whatever it might be, those are indicators about some things in our life. And, one of the questions, Jon, that we were talking about a few moments ago, that actually 2 Sundays ago I talked about, and had nothing to do with celebration. It had to do with Gideon, was a word, though, that I think that shows up really, really consistently in most all of our lives. It's that big 4-letter word called fear. That a lot of times there is a root of fear behind the things that we are doing or what we are not doing, right? So I identified for myself earlier on that if I let go of the wheel, my fear was I'm going to have to pay the price, clean up my own party, whatever it might be, right? And when we think about fear of stillness, right, that pause, what is that sort of stuff that comes up in us?
Yeah. And again, it's an invitation to be self-aware, because for some of you, the idea of going and spending a day, and again, this isn't like get totally monastic. You have to go up into the mountains and not speak for 24 hours, but it's just, if you were to interrupt your weekly rhythm for a day and do something very intentionally different, that would hopefully involve an extended period of time where you could connect with God, right? So stillness, quiet as part of that. Do you feel like that just opens the door for God to come in and blast you?
Yeah.
Right? It's about time you stopped. Let's talk about all the things you've been like. Is that the fear? That God's going to come in and blast me for all the things I've been doing wrong up till now? Right? Is it, yeah, great, I'm going to go spend some quiet introspective time thinking about all the ways that I'm falling short. That sounds like a great day. I'm not only not doing things, and I'm going to have to clean up after the fact. But,
I'm going to be told, yes.
Right. Of course you wouldn't want to do that. But honestly, for some of us, that's what's kept us from engaging with Sabbath. It's a fear that if I stop long enough, some of these things are going to surface, and I'm going to have to deal with them.
So I want to ask you a question. I didn't ask you this off.
Yeah.
And I think I know the answer, but in case there, when you're talking about being still and being quiet, certainly there is the literal aspects of sitting still and having quietness. But stillness and quietness, could it also be used as a way of even an activity that helps you focus more in the presence of God?
Absolutely.
All right. So the reason why I ask that is I think for some of us, maybe that first step is, all right, let's pick that activity that helps us do it, because that stillness, quiet, since we've not cultivated that, right? It's a good example, like when someone's like, I haven't read my Bible much. I'm like, I'm going to go read for 2 hours a day. Let's pause on that, right? Why don't we just pick 10 minutes, right? And work towards it. So what you hear John suggesting isn't that all of a sudden, you've got to go do the monastic thing, right? And sit down. Maybe it is something that seems monastic, and that's how your personality works, but maybe it's something else that doesn't seem monastic, but the key is that what helps you focus, right, in the stillness and the quiet and hear God well. That doesn't mean go find an excuse to do something else, right? It's not what I'm saying either, right? Because I have the ability to take anything good and kind of tweak it just a little bit to be not so good. But I just want to kind of pull on that a little bit.
Absolutely. There is no substitute for true stillness and quiet. Right? As with anything, there's degrees of good, but there really is no substitute for physical stillness and auditory quiet. You just can't beat it. But if we feel like that's the only way that we can ever communicate with God, we're falling into the trap of legalism.
Yeah.
Right? That God insists that, like a small child, I sit still in my seat and not make any noise, and unless I do that, he won't talk to me.
Sure.
Right? That's off the table. But there's also the misconception that most of us have that we're really good multitaskers. Which we're not. Scientifically proven, any good neuroscientist will tell you, like, your brain actually can't. All your brain is doing is shifting its attention from one thing to the next, just like you're channel surfing. You can't actually watch 4 shows at the same time. You can watch clips of 4 shows at the same time. So I'm going to sound like the Dos Equis guy. I don't always run, but when I run, I run.
There you go.
When I go running now, it used to be, music, it used to be podcasts, it used to be things to distract myself from the pain that my body was feeling of running. Now when I run with God, and I leave the headphones at home. I've actually even stopped with the run tracker. I don't care about my pace anymore. I'm not training for a marathon. I don't need to know my splits. I need to exercise. But more importantly, if I get rid of all of that, I'm also not hyper focused on my form and my pace. Like I'm just running. I'm just running, Forrest Gump style. I'm just running, and it opens up my availability for connection with God. And God and I have phenomenal conversations while I'm running because all the other distractions are gone, right? And something is occupying my body. So any restlessness is being taken care of. When I mow my lawn, you've talked about this. I don't do as well talking to God when I mow my lawn because I notice that my mind gets a little too preoccupied with the details. And I'm not one of those that I need that perfect diamond pattern in the lawn. No. Single passes for me. But my lawn is irregular enough that I just can't get into a groove with a rectangular lawn and just go back and forth and turn my brain off. There's enough curves, there's enough obstacles that if I turn my brain off, I hit something. So for me, that's actually not a place where I get meaningful connection with God. I can have moments and spurts here and there, but if I want to do something and connect with God, I know that I can do it running. I know that I can't do it as well mowing. I know that I really can't do it as well painting. And I'm not talking about on an easel, I'm talking painting a room. Because there again, the cutting in on the walls and trying to make sure that I'm rolling, even my brain is too focused on that to really
I'll be honest, if I wanted to destroy my relationship with Jesus, I'd try to paint and talk to him at the same time. That's not going to go well. Well, I think what you're bringing out is this is not a one-size-fit-all action. It's a one-size-fit-all principle that will then reflect itself in different actions because we're all uniquely and wonderfully made by God. And so for some people, the very idea of getting out and doing what you're doing with running seems crazy, or mowing lawn, which seems crazy. Find your thing, but it's still really good. And I love that reminder. I remember I had someone come in one time and they were talking, I just can't hear God well. And so, when someone says they can't hear God, and every single one of us been in phases, seasons, moments, whatever you want to call it, where we feel like we can't hear God well, or maybe not at all. In this particular case, they weren't. And so I just started, probing, like John, I know that you do a lot, and just asking some questions, not implication, just information. When you got down to it, what you discovered is that this person lacked any moment of quiet or stillness when they were trying to do it. And so while their intent and their heart was good, the way that they were approaching it, by how they were designed, what was going on, completely and utterly fought against it. So as an example, I'm really going to tell you, God can do anything. He is a miracle working God, but I'm pretty sure our ability to hear while we're flipping through cable news goes down.
Yeah.
It just does. Our ability to hear when, say, we're listening to music, right? I would say that there's a chance, we talked Maverick City Music a couple times on this. There's a couple songs I feel like God's always talking to me that way, right? And God's talked to me through Tom Petty as well. I mean, he can. But I do know that my ability to hear, based upon if I'm going to put music on and want to spend time with God, is often influenced by the things that I put there. I had a story years ago, I shared from the pulpit, where I got to mow. I don't know if you were around that Sunday. But I very specifically had to mow, and I very specifically did not want to talk to God. I just didn't. And, said, that's the moment we're hearing from God. And so I put on my iPod, or my iPhone, and I put on Tom Petty. And it was hilarious. I mean, it was comedy gold, if you would have been there, about how God said, all right, I'm just going to use this song and talk to you. You can't run from me.
Right.
And there was a lot of things he talked to me. I'm a little off subject, but coming back. But this idea of really just, what are you afraid of in that moment? For me, I mentioned it earlier on. For me, one of the things that I really get about when I take Sabbath is laziness. You had written a question down that we actually didn't talk about, that I was reflecting on earlier on, that it was like this check-in. How was your Sabbath the last 2 weeks? And I realized I struggle with my Sabbath. And here's why. I struggle with my Sabbath because I'm headed out for summer vacation for a little bit. So it felt weird and lazy if I actually take a Sabbath day and then I'm also going to take vacation, right? It's like, hold on a second. What do I do? I'm like, I'm going to be gone for X amount of days and people can't reach me. Mm-hmm. So what does it look like to say, well, I'm not going to answer my phone that day, or I'm not going to answer my email day. I would say that I got a solid D+ if we were grading, solid D+, because I recognized it was an active fight. But it was that moment, and part of that in there, the fear in that, it was like, oh, I'm lazy.
Sure.
Or like, I'm not, doing what I should do, which is really interesting. I know what I do, right? But in that moment, I was much more afraid of what I think other people might think of me than the God of the universe, who loved me enough to die for me, asked me to do, right? Yeah. And that, by the way, is called an idol, because as we talked about when we talked about Gideon, anything that comes before God. And so fear of man and what they might think, for lots of us, can become an idol. For me, that's one that I struggle with.
Yeah, absolutely. And so again, the most practical thing that we can offer first in this episode is just categories to consider as you're thinking about your ability or struggle with engaging with God through the rhythm of Sabbath and celebration. Right, and even this most recent one of, how can I Sabbath if I'm going on vacation, right? And realizing that God not only instituted Sabbath, but also instituted feasts and festivals, which we've talked about before.
Right.
And there was no place in the Mosaic Law where he said, look, if there's a feast or festival coming up, then I want you to skip Sabbath to make up for it.
True story.
Right? So I'm instituting, in some cases, week-long feasts and festivals, and I want you to observe the Sabbath.
And they came pretty often. If we, you have Passover, and then you had one just 40 days later on, right? Or 50 days later on. At Pentecost, I always get that mixed up.
Right.
Yeah, it was
with
pretty
7
quick.
Sabbaths in between.
Yeah. They make our federal holiday calendar look kind of...
Yeah. Right? And that's what God intended, right? The frequency of this gift, it's not a once a year at Christmas. It's 52 times a year plus feasts and festivals. I mentioned it 2 weeks ago that I heard somebody else talk about Sabbath this way, that Sabbath is more than a day, but it's never less than a day. 52 times a year, God gives us the gift of Sabbath plus these other times of the year when he invites us to again engage in this rhythm of rest and celebration. And so when we struggle with that, again, God in his brilliance instituted a profoundly beautiful gift that would not only take care of our body, but it would take care of our soul. Right? Our heart and our mind would become transformed through us learning him here.
Yeah.
And so that's the first step, is just be aware, become more aware of the internal struggle to truly engage in rest and celebration and Sabbath, to be aware of what we're afraid of, what we're hiding from, what we're not wanting to engage in. I know some folks that From the moment they get up in the morning, the TV's on or the music's on.
Mm-hmm.
And as they go through their day and they get into their car, the music's jamming, and there's nothing wrong with any of those things. But they come home and it's, the ESPN highlights of the day, or it's the 5 o'clock or the 6 o'clock, or it's a 24-hour news cycle. It's all the o'clocks news.
Yeah.
And when their head hits the pillow, it's the white noise machine, which again, I love the white noise sometimes, but it's, if you go through your whole day and there's no quiet, when do you expect God to show up?
Mm-hmm.
Because while God can do anything he wants, and frequently does, much to our surprise, we look at the character and consistency of God throughout the scriptures, and God, with the people that he's in relationship with, he doesn't like to shout. He will, but...
Yeah, if you think about it, anyone you're in a relationship, a healthy one, right? I don't know anyone likes to shout.
Yeah.
I don't like to shout over my son. He'll often, I appreciate that when he's playing games online with his friends that he puts his headphones on, right? I appreciate that part. But, when I want to get his attention, I don't like to shout.
Yeah.
And so I think that's such a great reminder about finding those moments. So if practically you don't take anything away from what we're talking about today, what would it look like for you to intentionally carve out some time, right, of peace and quiet, and then listen to what God is telling you? And again, for lots of us, we're like, well, what if he says this, and this? So know this: if it's condemning and calling you something other than your identity, that's not God's voice, right? God only speaks that which is true and good and right into our lives. And so there's tests we talk about how to know that before is God's voice. One, is it scriptural? Two, does it bring on the fruits of the Spirit? And there's some other ones. But lots of people are afraid because sometimes when they've been quiet, they hear accusation.
Sure.
And the good news, God is there for that and can walk through there. I'm all over the place today. So
No, that's good. Well, honestly, that's one of the best things that can come up in these days of rest is the removal of things that we're carrying that we don't even realize that we're carrying, right? So often Jesus was criticized for healing on the Sabbath, right? And he would talk about, this is what the kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of heaven is like people being restored. Yeah. And so what do you think is there anything God would love to do more than on the Sabbath bring healing and restoration? Right? And so if accusations come to the surface, that doesn't mean you're doing Sabbath wrong. It doesn't mean you should never do it again. It doesn't mean you should run away and never come back. It means God's bringing healing, right? He's allowed you, right? You got quiet, maybe for the first time all week. And so what's surfacing is you're lazy, right? You're not doing enough. People are going to think poorly of you if they ever found out that you were just sitting quietly here, right? Thank you, God, for allowing these things to surface, for showing me that at a heart level, there's still a part of me that believes that this is true. Yeah. And in this moment that you've set aside for rest and recovery, to have a conversation about what's actually true. That's Sabbath. And as you engage with God in that space and he shows you things that you've believed are true for a long time, and he's showing you, my son, that's not the way that I think about you. My daughter, that's not actually the case. Here's what's true. You know what happens in the aftermath of that exchange as God speaking literally transforms your mind and your heart to see truth? You want to celebrate. You want to celebrate the restoration to life that previously didn't exist 5 or 10 minutes ago. Yep. And look, here's a day set aside for celebrating.
And if you go back to what you were talking about earlier on, that section of scripture when you talked about the prodigal son and then the other brother, right? Yeah. That's Luke 15, and there's 3 stories there, all of them about things that are lost. And every time there is restoration of a relationship, restoration of a lost sheep, restoration of a coin. The result every time in Luke 15 is celebration.
Yeah. Get a group of people together and have a party to commemorate that I once was this way, or life was once this way. But now it's not. Yeah. That's Sabbath. That's celebration. And that's why it's so transformational. Because it's an invitation to do all of those things, to see God provide in 6 days when we swear it takes every bit of all 7 and an eighth if we could somehow figure it out, right? To have a moment of slowing down, to invite God to dig underneath the hood, spiritual checkup wise, and say, look, you've been carrying this for days, weeks, months, years, and and you don't have to. Let me take that off of you, and by the way, give you something good, which then prompts celebration, and it prompts a story to be told as well, which we talked about 2 weeks ago.
Yep.
This is one of the cool things that happens with Sabbath and with celebration in general, is it's an opportunity for story. I'd shared this multiple times previously, that one of the coolest things that happened to me was a little over a year ago during the season of Lent. I decided I was going to commit to daily time with God, extended more than I usually did. And for 35 days I did that. And on the 36th day, I got up and made my wife breakfast first instead of spending time with God, because I felt like God said, go make your wife breakfast. And I was like, okay, you're the boss. And then I came back and I immediately thought, God, you must be disappointed in me. That must have been a test, and I must have failed it, because I was supposed to spend my time with you first. And he showed me in that moment that there was a piece of me that still felt like God was ultimately just waiting to show me how disappointed he was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? That he was waiting to show me that I've missed it. Right? I've not done enough.
Now, was that easy or comfortable? But it was transformative.
Absolutely.
And that's, I think, the thing that we have to always remember, that it's not easy or comfortable, but that's kind of the point, right?
Sabbath's not easy or comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the point.
Yeah.
That transformation, and as God uses Sabbath and to connect about what we've been talking about all year, we've been talking about these rhythms, and Sabbath is part of our celebration rhythm. They are designed to transform us. Right? And you were talking about that. I think I remember that when we were going through the initial series that we talked about this year, when we got to this point, we were talking about daily devotion, spending time in that. God will use these, and it's not going to be comfortable, but it's going to be good.
Yeah.
It's going to be good. And I think as I look at some things that you had me process this week, and we've said this before, Jon takes the notes from Sunday of whoever's speaking, and he turns them into some things that we talk about. I'm so grateful for lots of reasons. It does lots of personal reflection for me when you have someone else look at even some things that you wrote and go, well, how do I always draw this sort of stuff out? But if it's not easy or comfortable now, what if it could be?
Yeah. Right?
What if it could be? I mean, I think when I read that question, I'm like, oh, that reframes it. That reframes, even if I find it uncomfortable, that sort of stuff, without trying to get it too mixed up in a goal-oriented Brian, what if it could be, right? What if all of a sudden this work at the gym says later on, I don't have to stop eating bacon? What if this were, whatever it might be? Yeah. What if it could be? How would that feel? What would it look like? I know for me, I am not there yet, but I so feel like every time God takes me to a point where I have less fear of man, like, and as I mentioned, in Sabbath, it shows up as laziness, right? What will people think about me? It shows up in some of the other ones differently, but that's how it shows up there more often than not. And what would it look like if it was like, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It does. Boy, I know that a lot of the stuff that I process, and I wouldn't be there anymore. And so every time that God's able to take me a little step, it's a little bit more of freedom, to use that term, to walk in the life that Christ has designed me to walk in.
Yeah.
But, what does that look like for you?
Yeah. So do that. Right, whatever your next Sabbath is, if you're still not sure what to do or how to do it or when to do it, find 15 minutes. Give yourself extended time. Don't make it 5, because it'll take the first 2 to settle in, and the last 1.5 you'll be thinking about what you're doing next. So give yourself some extended time and just think about what it could look like if Sabbath came naturally. Since I was 16, I wanted to play the guitar, and I've had an on-again, off-again relationship with my guitar, which I still own and still can't play well. But every once in a while, I think of what it would feel like to effortlessly play a song, to just have my fingers moving on the frets and have the pick or my fingers moving on the strings, and the music's just coming out. And I think of what that would feel like, and that feeling entices me to want to pick up the guitar again, because I know that if I spent enough time and enough intentionality, I could get to that point. Mm-hmm. I have the competencies. I just haven't invested the time. And so I found myself thinking, as I was putting this question together, of just sitting there and thinking, what would it look like a year from now if I spent a year, 52 weeks plus festivals, of really engaging with the idea of Sabbath and celebration. Honestly, it got me a little excited. More than a little. And I thought, I tried to picture myself a year from now of what I would be like after a year of getting in Sabbath shape. And it was a really cool feeling. I pictured a day where I could wake up on whatever day we had designated as Sabbath, because we've talked about Sunday's not a great Sabbath day for people that work at a church. And I could wake up and my first thought wouldn't be, what are the things I need to get done today that I can't do because it's Sabbath? And my first thought would be, what are we going to do today that's just going to be delightful? Like maybe it'd be a fun, leisurely breakfast. Maybe we'd have gotten in a routine with, like, let's try a new recipe. We've only made Eggs Benedict once. Let's see if we can try that and see what it would be like, and just engage in the fun and the adventure of cooking, because we like to cook. Again, if that's not your thing, that's not Sabbathy. Don't do that. And then maybe it'd be a leisurely stroll. And like, I'm not trying to over-romanticize this, but I was just thinking, like, after a year of practice, for me to just relax into Sabbath because it had become so normal. And the effect that it would have on me, I could feel a difference in my brain just thinking differently about Sabbath. And I could feel just emotionally like a level of peace. Looking ahead a year at something that hasn't even happened yet and going, that would feel amazing. Right? It gave me hope that because this is what God has asked, right? That this can't be impossible if this is what God has asked. It can't be impossible. It's not that we're only ever going to be either the orphan younger brother or the slavish older brother, because there's actually a third son. It's the one that was telling the story. Who's neither an orphan nor a slave, but was perfectly obedient, but also in perfect relationship with his father. And that's the guy telling the story of the Father's heart. That's the guy that models Sabbath, even as he's literally saving the world. That's the guy that models rest and celebration, and actually calls out the people that aren't celebrating when he's celebrating. And it just made me realize this is actually possible. Not only is this possible, but I could get good at this. There might be a day where it's no longer like my guitar, where it's endless struggle. But there could be a day like the one that I envision, where it just comes out. And that gives me hope. And that's part of what the Sabbath is about too. Is it's supposed to give hope. Not only for what has been, but because of what has been, what's still to come.
And so where's God leading you? Right?
Yeah.
Because he is. And it's not our job to tell you where God's leading you. God is the best one to lead your life. And of course, we're happy to walk alongside you if that's what God wants you to do. But resist the temptation to think, well, it's always something new. It may be something that you're already developing. It's just something that you just have to be maybe more consistent at. It might be something new. But ask him. We've gone a whole podcast and got near the end and we didn't say ask God yet. We almost, again, I don't know how we got that far, but it's important. But God is inviting you into this process. He's leading you into this. He didn't create this rhythm, this cadence, like, oh, well, I got to give this something different.
Right.
No, there's purpose in it. And the purpose, when we walk in it, it transforms us.
So we're going to go celebrate summer.
Oh, 50th episode. Is that
50th
true?
50th episode.
Yeah, 50. So there's like a gold star if you got all 50. We'll give you a gold star if you got 5. But 50,
Yeah. So we're going to go do some celebrating and some Sabbathing. Right? You're heading off on vacation that you did not have to earn. It's just part of a natural, healthy rhythm. I'm going to keep working on Sabbath until my vacation, probably in August. We're still working on the scheduling. And so go celebrate. Go Sabbath. And as we're all continuing to grow, we're going to take a break from podcasts for the summer. But if you feel like there's areas where you need to grow, maybe go back and rewatch the series on celebration. Maybe go back and rewatch some of the earlier ones. Because again, one of the things that Sabbath brings up is some of those internal realities that God is still wanting to address. And so maybe our recorded selves can help you with that. But like you mentioned, we're always happy to connect with you in person. So on behalf of Brian, I'm Jon. Thanks for letting us be a part of your journey. We'll see you next time.